Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Mónica García Blizzard, Associate Professor of Spanish at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
Prof. It's a great pleasure to meet you. There could be no bigger fan of your book on Mexican film than me, especially the cover, which we have to talk about at some point.
Absolutely.
But my opening gambit, now perhaps tired and yet always enriching in terms of what people respond with, no pressure, Prof, is to inquire as to what's currently preoccupying, interesting, impeding, dynamizing you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm delighted to meet you, to be in conversation with you. For me at the moment, what is front of mind is the concept of the dignity of working people. What does it mean to have a dignified life in the times we live in which many of the narratives and promises of the 20th century are not coming to fruition or are coming to fruition with very, very heavy costs for those of us who are under 40, I would say. Basic tenets of some of the narratives we've received, such as owning a home or healthcare, like some of the basic concepts to come out of the aftermath of World War II or to come out of the aftermath of some of the social struggles, even in the United States out of the 1930s, that kind of notion of the basic dignity that people need to exist is imperiled. Concepts also such as childcare, what is necessary to work, the things that are necessary to be a person today seem to be luxuries. And that is not a program that upholds the value of a person. So that is what I am thinking through. Of course, my discipline is cinema. I focus specifically on Mexican cinema. So the things I'm writing now have to do with those sorts of problems in cinema, how they've been represented, and so forth. But yeah, those are the topics that I am thinking through at this time.
When I became a US citizen, Prof, and you can tell from my accent that perhaps I wasn't born there, one of the questions you had to answer was which three countries won the Second World War? Now, the answer in order to gain your prize was America, not United States of America, England, not Britain, and France. Last I saw, the French spent years sending off Jewish people and queer people and communists in trains to be slaughtered. You couldn't answer the Soviet Union, which probably lost between 25 and 30 million people. You couldn't answer Mexico, which sent people to the Philippines in the war. You couldn't answer Brazil, which sent Air Force people to Europe. But as I said, you certainly couldn't answer the Soviet Union. But one of the things about that war, and this is a point that Foucault makes somewhere, is that after the horror of the Depression, which for my parents born in the 20s was actually a more profound influence than the war, because their fathers couldn't work, their mothers couldn't work, their grandparents couldn't work, no one had shoes for school. For that generation that then went off to war, the deal was you will never be unemployed again if you come back, which was partly the alibi for displacing women from employment, of course, in manufacturing in the US and elsewhere, but also was part of the United Nations when it reincarnated itself, not as an alliance, but as a sort of world government, to guarantee full employment as part of what would happen. And so many of the things you mention were achieved by the labor movement, as you imply, by trade unions, but also as a quid pro quo for all these men going off to war, women losing lovers, husbands, sons, brothers, and of course the many women killed in the war too, and otherwise suffering. This would be the payoff. When we win, now that we've rebuilt economies because of war, there will always be work. And implied in that, I think, is the concept of dignity that you mentioned.
Yes. Yeah, I think something that fascinates me at the moment, so all of the movements that you have just mentioned, there was a secular notion. Somehow there was a coalescing of a secular notion of human dignity that had a material, had to have some sort of match in material reality. And that we seem to have, of course, I'm not an economist, I'm not attempting to position myself as such, but I think it is clear to anyone trying to live now that we seem to be in a circumstance of, one has to succeed sufficiently in capitalism in order to have a legitimate claim to things that at the period of time you're mentioning were considered to be part of a human person's dignity. So I guess I'm really interested in how that coalescing of a secular concept of human dignity has deteriorated to the point that we, at least, often in the US, and of course we've exported this, to other parts of the world, that, well, if you're just a loser in capitalism, then, work harder. Like, this is the consequence of you being a loser of capitalism, as opposed to kind of those previous notions that you've mentioned of, well, as a human person, you should have dignity, and that requires some kind of material investment, and that therefore it is moral, right? It's moral and it's just to provide that for people. So I really, as of course, the humanities and in most parts of the world, we tend to have sort of a leftist kind of intellectual trajectory, and that's wonderful, and we need to know that. But I am so interested in just exploring any concept from anywhere that is dealing with this. And I have recently reread the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum of 1891 that has an interesting, response to Marx that upholds a concept of dignity. And so I am just interested in looking high and low for thought on dignity.
Well, I think the Catholic Church gives you that because it's always been very physiocratically inclined. And of course, the particular Pope you refer to, John Paul II, was a very was a workerist. It's not.
So Rerum Novarum is from 1891. So it is Pope Leo I believe the 13th, if I'm not mistaken. And actually,
oh, sorry.
1891, sorry, 1891.
1891,
yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. It's long-standing. And buenos, ¿qué tal? If I jump forward a century, pardon my mistake, that Pope, who was John Paul II, I think, right? He was a very workerist guy for all his reactionary tendencies, but he was upholding a long tradition in the Catholic Church, but against the detour into Marxism that had happened, especially in Latin America, I think it's fair to say. Yeah?
Yes.
The worker priests and so on.
Yes. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm interested in concepts of human dignity that can help us return to a sort of material basis that allow people to live.
And live a fulfilling life. And I think that's where a lot of ideas of human rights come from. So no surprise that a lot of them come to us after the Second World War, but a lot of them derive from various parts of Christianity in particular, without necessarily announcing themselves as not being secular. They've been as secular since, I think.
Yes. So to this end of my trying to understand this, I have been revisiting Kant, who is, in the sort of bibliography of human dignity. Obviously, the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 is a very sort of symbolic document that it has a relationship, is in dialogue with Kant's notion of dignity. And interestingly, his notion of violence, which is to reduce the other to a calculus, right? Which I think often in capitalism, we have to be very careful of that. I think we live in a world where people are often treated as just a means to an end, as opposed to, as Kant says, an end in their own right. And of course, Kant is, an Enlightenment thinker. He's not thinking in particularly religious terms. So yeah, I'm just interested in bringing together a realm of concepts that can help us stake a claim to a viable vision of human dignity.
Yes, and that also relates to all kinds of philosophical notions, not only from Western Europe, but from Latin America too. In particular, when it comes to seeing a oneness between land and person, and the necessity in rights terms to treat the natural world as one wishes to be treated. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree with you. And of course, yeah, we have a lot to learn from Indigenous intellectuals on that score, of which I'm not an expert, but there is a rich thought tradition, of course, of respecting nature, which of course is not alien to even Judeo-Christian concepts of respecting creation, right? There is a point of intersection that we can identify among those invested in livability and dignity. Right?
Getting on to the film incarnation of this, Prof, before we do talk about your book and its, for me, very provocative cover because of the look on the woman's face. As I said, we'll get on to that. This is a teaser to keep people listening, right?
Sure.
For when you explain my hermeneutic confusion to me. Before we get on to that, tell us about what you're seeing in film in terms of human dignity. Is there something there that you're noticing in the recent past, in the further past?
So I am at this moment, this question is taking me back to neo-realism. You may have noticed that I have a background in Italian studies.
Yes.
Yes. So Italian film, it's easy to fall in love with, obviously. So anyway, these questions of human dignity, right? They are very prominent in neo-realism. And of course, Sabatini very provocatively tells us that he's not suggesting that the directors should propose solutions, but feel the need for solutions, right? And so that is where I am sort of identifying connections to dignity and indignity. I think I have at the moment I have an interest in why is it that those films endure? What is it that they do that provided an international idiom for people, up to the current day that are interested in issues of indignity of the marginalized. And of course, being a Mexicanist, I'm thinking about this in around the 1950s in Mexico, when some of the promises of the revolution were not pursued or put in a place of lesser priority. And so I'm thinking about those connections at the moment. But for me, even in our own conversation, right, we went right back to the end of World War II. That in terms of film, that's where I sort of am as well, which given what I have published so far is not surprising. That is kind of, for whatever reason, a bit of my home base. But yeah, I'm thinking through those issues in that time and place, and why that filmic idiom works across time and space. Right.
Prof. Monica, as you say, some of those things about Italian neorealism are about rubble and hellish circumstances, actors who are ordinary people, in inverted commas, and making do, generating happiness as well as hell. And it's there's a lot of echa la ley, echa la trampa, right? So it's like langue and parole. Here's the law, here's how you actually live. The bicycle thief would be, I guess, a classic of that. Would that be fair? Would be paradigmatic, yeah.
Yeah, that is a film I come back to, particularly, again, I think in particular, one of the issues that interests me is the striving for a personal dignity in circumstances of material scarcity, because given our state of capitalism that we're in, our levels of consumption, those two don't go together, right? You in our current framework or hegemonic framework, you have no way, you have no door into dignity unless you have sort of material abundance. And yet we know that's not true on a human level. And I think these films illustrate, I think one of the most fascinating things that they do that I'm interested in is that they demonstrate sort of a human capacity to transcend material scarcity. Even just thinking about the love between the husband and the wife, or the relationship between the father and son. It is not a materially deterministic worldview, right? That scarcity in one realm determines scarcity in one's humanity. So I find that very provocative and countercultural for the times that we live in which we celebrate consumerism, and make that our goal and our indication of personhood and value. So that's where I am intellectually. I have a long way to go for this project.
Well, it's exciting to let us into your process. It's like a work in progress. Somebody who doesn't figure much in your book, just fleetingly, who I think might fit into some of this, is Cantinflas.
Oh, absolutely. Well, absolutely. If I may call you Toby. Yes. So one of the aspects of the project that I'm working on, Sabatini spent time in Mexico because he was hired by Manuel Barbachano Ponce's company, originally called Teleproducciones and later called Producciones Barbachano Ponce. And so he came to Mexico, and they had some differences of opinion. So the films were not made, but I had the opportunity to read some of the scripts at the Biblioteca Panizzi in Reggio Emilia. And one of the ones that he wrote for Cantinflas, or with Cantinflas in mind.
Really?
And so absolutely. So this is very, which within neorealism itself, of course, famously, neorealism, it's not this cohesive thing. It's different individuals, different visions. And I think a film like Miracolo a Milano, right, the A Miracle in Milan, is sort of indicative of this kind of more ludic, playful, popular, comedic sort of approach.
And naughty. He's like the naughty teenager, or the slightly batty uncle in the corner at Christmas time. Cantinflas, right?
Yes.
He's winking at you all the time. We're in this. I mean, it's probably very sexist if one looks at it analytically, but there's something almost visceral. It is like the naughty kid whom you can't keep your eyes off.
Yeah. So I am interested in, not for the purposes of my book, but in general, there are many ways into studying the dignification, if we can say, of popular classes. One of them is the strategy of someone like Cantinflas, which is making this person a protagonist. He has value. He, is clever in ways that the sort of straight men are not. There's also the approach of melodrama, right, which has often been quite denigrated is too strong a word, but has not been the darling of many Latin American critics, right? Because it was sort of seen to be, complicit with capitalism, complicit with industry, complicit with things that were not progressive. But, if we think about a film like Nosotros los Pobres, right? Which was, by the way, the most seen and screened film of the 20th century in Mexico. Well, what does melodrama do? It monumentalizes. In this case, it monumentalizes the poor. So there are many ways into this subject. I, in particular, with this project, I'm thinking about the realist modes, but I actually am teaching a course for the spring semester called Latin American cinema screening the people. And what I intend to offer my students is precisely an introduction to all of these modes, right? Comedy, melodrama, realism, so that they can understand what are the ways of representing the people. Yeah.
Get me on the next train to
Yeah.
Urbana.
To Champaign. Yeah.
I guess it would be the train they call the City of New Orleans. So on to your book that's out, Prof.
Yeah.
Before we get on to my fetish with the cover, my problem with the cover, my issue, tell us about the white Indians of Mexican cinema, racial masquerade throughout the Golden Age.
Well, this is a book that it is a bit of a trick, I will say, because there's what it's about and then there's what it's really about. So what the book is
okay.
yeah. So
Definitely
what it's about,
echa la trampa.
yeah. So what it is what it presents, announces itself as being about is about a corpus of films made in the mid-20th century in Mexico, starting from the early 30s, going all the way, the last film is from 1970, about films that purport to represent indigeneity, and in particular, these films center women because women sort of became the preferred avatar for indigeneity in the context of the Cultural Revolution of Mexico. So films that purport to represent indigeneity, but use a Mexican construct of whiteness to present this image. So it's about essentially, if you read the back of the book, what it says is that it's a book about a contradiction or friction between two discourses. So one is the post-revolutionary discourse that ostensibly celebrates indigeneity and makes it the symbol of the country and something that as Mexicans we should be proud of, and then a long-standing but always mutating discourse of whiteness in Mexico that privileges, rewards, prefers, projects a local image of whiteness. So there were a few things I wanted to do. So that's what the book is about. As I wrote the book, I wrote it in the following way. I wrote an introduction that could hopefully interest people that are not necessarily specialists of Mexican cinema or of Latin American cinema in general, but just people who are interested in this issue of race in Mexico. And then I have all of the chapters that are the case studies of these specific films, and each chapter deals with a specific discourse of indigeneity and the way in which this sort of crystallization that I call whiteness as indigeneity, this sort of what I call a semiotic trick, is used as an instrument to manifest and transmit a very specific discourse on indigeneity. So there's that. And then another thing I really wanted to do was just, a lot of just sort of put into conversation all of the very valuable film theory about race. But because a lot of that theory has tended to originate in the Anglosphere, it tends to be very black-white in its language and in the way it conceptualizes race. And I wanted to bring that into conversation with the bibliography of the decolonial Latin Americanist bibliography, and also the Mexican thinkers who have addressed, right, a lot of these issues, anthropologists and historians. So put those into conversation to be able to explain how whiteness is operating in Mexico in a way that certainly has a lot in common with the observations that have been made about media coming in of the Anglosphere, but which also has its own nuances. I think those were the goals. That's what I was trying to do.
There's also a moment early on in the book where you talk about your friends saying, Prof. Monica, why is everybody so white in Mexican cinema? Or words to that effect. Yeah?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you're extremely prolific, so maybe this isn't true for you, but writing is hard work. Writing is very hard work. And one of the North Stars I have as I write is just trying to anchor myself in what I know to be true. And so that conversation, I know it to be true. I have found myself in it many times. You know, we all have. Any of us who deal with this media, show this media to our students, or even just family and friends, right? Who may be having their first encounter with Latin American media. It doesn't take a genius to observe that the way in which uh, many Latin American countries present themselves in the media is is not an indexical, right, reflect. Of course, it never is for any country, right? There's all kinds of distortions of indexicality that happen across many societies. But in particular, this one is a flor de piel, as we say, right? It's very, it's just on the surface. It's very easy for people to note. But the fact of observing that, I felt required a deep dive.
I guess one of the
Right.
things too is getting back to the black-white continuum of the Anglo world, that indigeneity in Latin America is completely different from how it's understood in the so-called white settler colonies,
Mhm,
Canada, New Zealand, Aotearoa, Australia, the United States, and so on.
mhm,
Here, there's only been one indigenous president in
mhm,
Mexico because
mhm,
indigenous means 100% biogenetically, culturally still. And
mhm,
being mixed race, although it's the norm here and has its own problematic as well as promising ideology, simply doesn't qualify you as indigenous. And
yes.
friends of
Yeah.
mine who biogenetically are indigenous Mexicans but have never learnt their people's language do not identify as indigenous, for example.
Mhm, mhm.
And that's
Yeah.
very hard for people in the white settler colonies to understand because the British, the French, and so on had a different sexual policy of colonization from the
Mhm,
Spanish and the Portuguese.
mhm,
And so there was more rape and more intermarriage in Latin America that made for a very different constitution of personhood and many more colonizing men than was the
mhm.
case in these other countries where colonizing men were a majority until the First World War, but colonizing women were there in large numbers too. So I think that's another thing that complexifies things if we start out with the racial formation, say, of the
Mhm.
United States.
Yes, absolutely. So the concept of the racial formation is absolutely basic for this study. And that is, as I said, one of the things I wanted to do was simply explain, whiteness, right? It operates differently in different spaces. And of course, that also means that the other categories against which it is defining itself also operates in different ways. So yes, you're absolutely right. The concept of, right, mestizaje, it is complex. It is very different to how race operates in the Anglosphere. And of course, I mean, in the case of Mexico, you have to recall that post-independence, racial terminology is eliminated, right? Which is very different from what happens in a country like the United States, in which being a Black person is a legal condition, right? It's a legal status. Of course, there is always, I'm not suggesting that there are no racial problems in Mexico. What I'm saying is they have their nuances. And so the raison d'etre of the book is specifically to say, yes, there is all of this discourse of mestizaje, but here is how it is operating in ways that are not particularly um, don't particularly match what the discourse says that it is doing, right? Or its aspirations, right? Visually, something else is happening.
There's also an interesting trope that lands one on the Spaniards in terms of calling it the Época de Oro,
Mhm.
because for the Spanish, that's what 16th century literature,
Mhm.
right? So having a golden age of something Mexican that's cultural, artistic, aesthetic is also intervening in the claim made to that notion of a golden age, a golden epoch that is used by the Spanish, by critics, by las letras españoles, etc. Right?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, that's not my term, right? That's a term that exists in
Yes.
the, yeah, it's a term that I think has done a lot to celebrate Mexican cinema. And to be clear, another thing I was trying to do was do these and engage in these analyses without suggesting all of this needs to be canceled. On the contrary, some of these films are incredibly artistic, beautiful works of art that should continue to be seen and are fascinating, right? Not to suggest that, oh, these films have been, part of this golden age, but I'm taking down the golden age. No, I have no interest in that. No, we have just trying to explain their complexity, and I think that actually does them credit, right? Saying they are complex cultural artifacts that merit sophisticated analysis.
I can't wait any longer, Prof.
Okay, go
Maybe
ahead.
the listeners can't either. La Sandunga.
Yes.
Spill the beans, Prof. Let us know.
Okay. What would you like to know?
Well, obviously describing the film itself and your take on it, but also the work it does on the cover.
Okay.
There's a still from it, a very famous shot, but one that is extremely provocative in the context of the title of your book, I think.
Yeah, so as you know, like a title, a cover is an important decision. It's the visual title of the book, right? So I chose, for those of you who maybe haven't seen it or don't have it in front of you, it's a picture of the famous actress Lupe Velez dressed as a Tehuana. She is relaxing on a hammock. She is in a state of leisure. And to me, it simply represented all of the arguments of that particular chapter and all of the arguments of the book. And it also isn't a film that has received a wide amount of attention. Of course, so like, for example, the films of Emilio Fernandez are extremely well known. The actresses that he put in leading roles they grace the covers of many books. So I really wanted to perhaps shed light on an actress and a particular film that it represented the arguments, but is perhaps not as ubiquitous. Yes. So for me, yeah, so that image in particular, right, you have all of the elements of the argument, which is, this is Lupe Velez, right, who, as I discuss in the book, drawing on many other scholars who have analyzed her, she in the Mexican context, she has the advantage of having a physical presentation that associated her with a Spanish type. And in this film, she plays a Tehuana. In this particular moment, she's resting, right? So I wanted to illustrate that she's in a state of leisure, right? Which is very different from the sort of state-sponsored Cultural Revolution mythology about the Tehuana, right? That we would see in, for example, many iterations about the Tehuana being sort of like this matriarch who works and takes charge of everything. She is beautiful. And also I wanted to show how Golden Age cinema was drawing on previous images of this trope. So for example, here there's a very clear correspondence to Eisenstein's image of the Tehuana, who is also shown on a hammock, but she was bare-breasted, right? But of course, we can't have that in commercial Golden Age cinema. So Lupe Velez is very covered. And yeah, so that was behind the selection of the image. But I wonder how it spoke to you or why it is of interest to you.
Well, this is a little bit sexual on my part. It's slightly macho interpretation. But she looks post-orgasmic.
Oh, interesting.
To me. There's something about her eyelids, her cheeks, her lips, everything that is very relaxed in that sort of idiom. So that's why it's sort of, that's how it speaks to me. But as I say, that's probably a very macho or at least masculinist perspective. The other thing is, because of who she was, there's a tragedy that I see immediately because she died very young, apparently by her own hand. And she does represent cross-border territoriality because she was in Hollywood before she was in Mexican cinema.
Yes, correct.
And shuttled back and forth. So those things come to me. There's the immediate sort of, my God, look at the look on this woman's face. But then quite quickly, beyond that very interpretative account of mine, there are all the facts, in inverted commas, about her on-screen and off-screen life. And there's something in the tragedy there that is such a big part of Mexican culture.
Yeah, she is a fascinating figure. In some of my courses, I do teach her Mexican Spitfire films, particularly the first one, where she's very animated. She completely commands the frame. She speaks in Spanish, sometimes with no subtitles, but she has also like something that has interested scholars is that she also appears quite elegant, right? In the way she's dressed, right? So she's not in those contexts fulfilling perhaps all of the stereotypes that were put onto Mexican women at the time. She is a very complex figure. What I suggest in that chapter is that particular film tries to recognize some of her comedic prowess and allow a space for it. But within this framing of melodrama that also requires that she be sort of the compassion-worthy victim. That's another important part of the argument of the book, is that the reason is that whiteness as indigeneity happens when we have two components. We have the protagonist is a compassion-worthy victim, so we have to feel bad for them, and they also have to be sexually desirable. So even though my analysis of that particular frame was not emphasizing sexuality, it is absolutely, the mechanisms of desire are fundamental to the argument, right? In contrast to, for example, tropes that have been theorized, such as, for example, brown face, where it's a very different dynamic. There is it's possible to sometimes feel bad for the characters, as we do, for example, for a figure like La India Maria, but crucially, the element of sexual, romantic, aesthetic desire is not operating there. So part of what I was trying to do in the book was sort of add this trope of whiteness as indigeneity to our repertoire of blackface and brownface, to sort of explain that racialization can also operate in this other way. And I had not yet seen that in the literature.
And this is also offering a reinterpretation of mestizaje. Mestizaje, mixedness, often valorized as something wonderful by US-based Latino, Latinx scholars, but much more problematic on the ground, I think. And you, in terms of the intense class division that is evident in so much of Latin American society based on one's phenotypical characteristics, and leading in Mexican society to the rendering invisible of Afro-Mexicans, for example, until very recently. So I wondered if you could maybe take us through some of the pluses, minuses, what you call the reframing of mestizaje that you offer in the book.
Yes. So I was quite lucky in that at the time that I was thinking about this project, working on it, originally part of my dissertation, later, there's a whole process that happens to make it into a book. In my discipline, the issue of whiteness in Mexico was not front and center. However, I came along at a time when many anthropologists and sociologists who were Latin Americanists were publishing on this, and yes, and historians as well. So if you look at the notes in the book, which I insisted be on the same page as the prose, you will see many references to anthropologists and sociologists and historians who essentially have in, I would say, the last 20 years, noted that the discourse of post-revolutionary mestizaje, that, you know, we are all mestizos, we are all the same, we are all equal as citizens, is not reflected in even like on the socioeconomic level, right? There's some studies that even show economic breakdown by skin color. Many wonderful scholars, Mónica Morena Figueroa, Federico Navarrete Linares, you know, historians like anthropologists, Alicia Castellanos Guerrero, a lot of scholars. So essentially, in my own discipline of, you know, literary, cultural, and film studies, I asked myself, well, I'm not a sociologist. Clearly, I'm not going to do this sort of economic research. Well, what to me illustrates this fact that we are not equal. There are massive differences. And in order to do that, you have to get outside of what the law can ordain. And that has to do with desire, right? And with aesthetic privileging aesthetically. And that takes you to the area of film and media. And of course, this thing that we all know to be true, which is that our media does not reflect, is not indexical, right? Which again, in no media is perfectly indexical, but on that particular issue, it was quite far off. And so what I say in the book is that breach of indexicality, as I call it, requires, it means that a very strong ideological force is at work. And yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Prof, go ahead.
No, that's it. That's it.
I was just going to say, one of the people whom you cite a fair bit is Peter Wade.
Yes.
And I don't know him, but everyone says he's a wonderful person. But quite apart from that, he is someone who really tries to bring race and sex together in discussions of Latin America, perhaps most prominently Brazil, but he does it with reference to other countries as well. And I think from this social science background, as opposed to the humanities one, I think that's very suggestive. But I also take your point about desire being something that is obviously central to cinema, and especially when affairs of the straight heart are important, as in so much of the Época de Oro.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the questions that I often ask my students is, what are they selling here? What is being sold? Why are people coming back? And of course, we have to sort of time travel and recall that these are like these very large screens, so they are monumentalized, right? These beautiful women. Yes, desire is definitely at work. Of course, Peter Wade is central, and one of the most useful aspects of Peter Wade's work in the specific context of this project was he talks about the very unique position of white women in New Spain, right? And how it was obviously, this is not going to surprise anybody, but it's not acceptable, right, for them to marry outside of their group. And so while obviously, Spanish men had license, and obviously we can't sort of just simplistically impose that fact from the colonial era onto the 20th century. And in the book, I do try to take us, step by step through the ways in which the discourses of whiteness have evolved over time. But this sense of the preciousness of the white Spanish woman in the context of Mexico, it isn't surprising to me that then becomes a sort of locus of desire in the cinema that comes to fruition in the 20th century. And of course, this has connections, again, with what has been theorized specifically by Richard Dyer, who I also cite, constantly in the book, because of course he wrote the book White, and he has a lot of thoughts on how whiteness works in the Anglosphere, in the media. So there is that connection of how the preciousness of the white woman in US cinema works. So I am trying to put those two in conversation. And of course, interestingly, some of the women like Lupe Vélez, who can occupy that position in the Mexican context, finds herself otherized to some extent, right? I use the terminology of Maria de Guzman, the concept of off-whiteness, right? She occupies the off-whiteness. in the US context. So which is one of the reasons why the Mexican Spitfire films are so interesting, because she's a legitimate wife in that case. She's not a mistress. She's not, yeah.
She's the real deal. And that inevitably turns me on to La Malinche.
Okay, yes.
Is a figure that occurs in the book, I think in a footnote, not an end note, as you were saying, in a footnote. You talk about the origin myth of La Malinche, but you also refer to her incarnation in cinematic character.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that there's been a very powerful reconceptualization of La Malinche from being a damned figure to being a feminist and indigenous heroine. From being someone who slept with the opposition to being someone who was clearly an immensely gifted linguist and was able to very quickly to learn Spanish and to be able to translate between Spanish speakers and the several indigenous languages she spoke, and someone who had very limited options as an indigenous woman in the context of the conquest. And I think here of Jean Franco's work as being very important in the reconsideration of La Malinche.
Yeah.
Now,
I have it right here.
Ah, great. She was she really was a wonderful person. My God, incredible work. But I wondered if, even though I know La Malinche is in a sense off to one side in your book, you could talk a bit about that question, because you do discuss the prohibition or the denunciation of interracial marriage. You know, I mentioned the only indigenous Mexican president and how he was deemed inferior because he married someone who wasn't indigenous. He was deemed inferior to her. So,
yes,
sorry, this is a very long-winded question, but it is perhaps the most complex thing in the sexual cultural history of Mexico for me.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's a question that anybody with a passing familiarity with Mexican culture would want to know, is why, you know, what does Malinche have to do with your book? So on the one hand, she's
there. She keeps reappearing, Prof.
Yes. Yeah. She does, absolutely. So she appears in, there's a film that was made in the 1950s, Chilam Balam. It's in the chapter about white Mayans, I believe. And what that film offers, it's interesting. I analyze it as a sort of Mexican attempt at a sword and sandals film. Right. And the protagonist of that film, the female protagonist, Naya, she is a sanitized Malinche figure, right? So of course, I believe this film comes out around 1955. I don't have all the dates top of mind at the moment. But, and of course, we have to, you know, remember El Laberinto de la Soledad, like, which is the text that really positions Malinche in a so culturally unfavorable position discursively, very prominent, right? I think that's what that text does for La Malinche. It suggests that she is a necessary figure to understand who Mexicans are, but it sort of positions her as kind of how many people have talked about it as a Mexican Eve type figure, right? Whereas, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In recent decades, you know, revisionisms have taken place to recover her as a forceful female that you know should be a source of pride. So the intermarriage issue, I think another place where she is sort of present by comparison is in the chapter about men, right? Which is what all of the vast majority of the chapters are about women, because as I mentioned at the top of our conversation, the female indigenous figure is the one that gets the exposure as being representative of indigeneity in the context of the post-revolutionary cultural program. And so how are men present? I discuss a series of films that are about interracial couplings among white Mexican women and indigenous men, and a lot of them end in death or illness, or, you know, it's basically not possible. So I think that's another way in which the Malinche narrative is present in the book, is that those films about indigenous men and white Mexican women who are couples violate that narrative, and therefore the men have to die. The men die, there is no possibility of having that, because it contradicts the sort of the foundational narrative of Mexico at that time. Yeah, reversing the gender configuration is not viable.
So, Prof, I have one last question for you, if I may. And when you've answered that, wanted to give you some space to add anything you wish that might take the form of entirely new material, terrain we haven't covered, or it may be that you go back over areas we have traversed, but where you want to add something. Does that sound okay as a neat drawing
absolutely
close?
Yeah.
So my last question really is, you're in the pretty early phases of the second book, by the sound of things. It's a question about your research and thinking process. Do you already know roughly what the chapters cover, or do you not think that way and instead you dive into the whole process of the question of the dignity of work and cinema, learn lots, think lots, and then come up with chapters, for example?
Yeah, so I've been reading for this project and doing archival visits for this project since fall of 2022.
Wow. When your book came out, I think probably.
Yeah. So the book came out in April of 2022.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, the way the tenure system works in the US, one of the things you have to demonstrate to get tenure is what's next. How is that? How does, what is there any there? What concrete actions are you? So, which is in a way a good thing because it sort of propels you into some sort of action. So I have been reading and doing archival work, since fall 2022 for it. And so it is, for me, it's a back and forth. So there's, you have a core issue, you think you have some ideas, and then you go and I go and I read and I visit the archive, and then I come up with a sense of what the chapters could be. And I present some of that at professional conferences, which is also a part of, I enjoy doing it, but it's also part of the job. And so then, then you get some feedback, and then I go back to the reading a bit more. So it's a little bit of a back and forth motion. And I think that for many of us, one of the challenges of academic work is when to stop reading. Like, when have you read enough? When do you just need to when do you need to start writing something? Yes. So it is sort of that back and forth
Lovely
motion. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really, really helpful. And anything you want to add, Prof?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the book, The White Indians of Mexican Cinema, Racial Masquerade Throughout the Golden Age, it is open access. I was the beneficiary of a grant allowing for it to be published. It is published through SUNY University Press, so it is an academic book in that sense, but it is available for free online for anyone who is interested in reading it. And that was a very deliberate choice for me. I'm just interested in sharing ideas, and for non-academics, right? This is not necessary. It is an academic book because of the nature of the context in which I wrote it, which is as someone in academia. But one of my aspirations was for it to be comprehensible to people who just are interested in cinema, are interested in race, are interested in Mexico. And if you are kind of nerdy, the footnotes are there for you if you want to go look at some of that. But it is open access because I think that one of the meaningful opportunities we have as academics is to share our ideas. And I think open access is one of the ways we can do that. So please feel free to find it online. It is there for you to do that. So
couldn't agree more. And Prof. Mónica García Blizzard, thank you so much for being with us. I've learned a lot and I've really enjoyed chatting to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.